It's now time for Northwest Ohio Journal, WBGU-TV's award-winning public affairs program, with your host, Steve Kendall. This is where your community matters. Local people, local issues.
Hello and welcome to Northwest Ohio Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. African Americans over the past 200 years have not needed to read stories about ghosts and haunted mansions to experience horror. But a number of African American writers have embraced the Gothic genre of literature to express the madness and danger of black people's existence. Dr. Maisha Wester, an assistant professor of English and American Culture Studies at Bowling Green State University, has written African American Gothic, Screams from Shadowed Places. Easy for her to say, but not me. Dr. Wester, welcome to Northwest Ohio Journal.
Thank you.
Now, you've written this book and kind of described the overview, because I know that it traces slave narratives and all the way up to contemporary African American writers. What's the general concept of the book? The title's very intriguing. Okay.
Well, I mean, it's a study of how African Americans in every major literary period of African American literary canon have appropriated the Gothic in different ways. It's not as if they've each appropriated the Gothic in the same way from generation to generation. It changes with each generation, as if building upon each other until it becomes this really complex interrogation, not just of oppression between races, but also oppression within the African American community as well.
Okay. Yeah, now when you're talking the different approaches, the Gothic approaches, what would be some of the differences among the writers that you've talked about? Some of them are taking parts of the Gothic approach, other ones taking other parts. What would be some of those differences that some of them would use?
Well, so for instance, when you look at the slave narratives, what you see is a basic inversion of the Gothic in which the good guys are no longer in white, right? So blackness comes to signify goodness, comes to signify victimization at times, but also heroism, where whiteness is quite often a signifier of corruption, of decay, of haunting. And so the problem is that they also keeps some of the gender and sexual ideologies of the traditional Gothic. So some of the ideas about, the proper heroine remain at play in the slave narratives. Ideologies about heteronormativity remain at play, at stake in the slave narratives. Whereas you see in later Gothic texts, such as Randall Keenan's text, there's a real critique of heteronormativity, a real critique of gender norms, and a challenge to the traditions that are at play in the Gothic and in the larger society as well, right? So it's a multifold critique. It's a critique of society at stake, at large, a critique of African American community, and a critique of the Gothic genre, even as those writers are using the Gothic to express the complexities of black existence.
Right. And I guess the tie-in there, as you've described, is that we're taking basically a fictional writing genre, but using it to reflect the nonfiction, real-life experiences of African Americans.
Yeah, so what's really interesting in your average African American Gothic text is that the horror doesn't come necessarily from the supernatural itself, right? The best example of this is Beloved, in which you have an actual ghost present. Most people tend to forget that Beloved is in many ways a ghost story, right? It starts off with this haunting of a house 124 by the baby ghost. Right. But that's not what the source of horror is. And the text cues us not to be horrified by the ghost itself. Setha, the mother of the story, says, early on, well, we have this baby ghost in this house. Don't worry about it. Every now and then she throws a fit, as if it's
just normal.
It's every day.
Get used to it, sort of.
Yes, and Baby Suggs, one of the older matriarchs of the text, notes that there's not every house in the country is haunted by some dead person's grief. So this is typical, right? It's nothing to be terrified of. The horror comes from the ways we treat each other, right? Comes from the treatment of the slave owners that would make a mother slaughter her children, comes from the ways that the community stands by and watches this woman slaughter her children, and the ways they ostracize not just the mother, but the children afterwards. I mean, imagine a community in which not only does his mother attempt infanticide, but after she's released from prison, the community lets the children remain in this isolated home with the mother, right? And so it's these sorts of complex horrors that we commit against each other. That's the real source of horror in your average African American Gothic text. It's not the supernatural itself, it's not a ghost, it's not the vampires. Those are to be expected, anticipated, and easily debunked. It's the reality of existence.
Now, and it's interesting because, when we think of Gothic, we think supernatural. That's the normal, quick reaction is, oh yes, it's ghosts or it's beings, it's not humans that are the issue. How obviously, you've gathered information as other researchers have and other academicians. How has this been received over the years? Because obviously, the narratives from the 1800s, different era, different approach to just about everything in terms of acceptance. How has this been received over the years? Is this now this sort of a more contemporary acceptance, or has it been accepted but just people haven't been aware of it over the years?
I think it's been accepted, but people haven't been aware of it over the years. So if we think about, for instance, the early Gothic literature, writers such as Charles Brockden Brown, in which there was the suspicion of something supernatural happening, but later on in the text you discover it was just a bit of trickery, right? Nathaniel Hawthorne, while there may be the devil at play in his haunted forest, what's really terrifying is the spiritual existence of the actual people, right? And so the sense of the supernatural as not being the true source of horror isn't necessarily entirely new. I think what we're seeing in African American Gothic is a return to some of the more traditional Gothic motifs, only to emphasize, again, the extreme horror, the extreme nature of Black existence in America. I think quite often, because it's understood as African American literature is understood as a literature that's either in the realist mode of writing, that's presenting the actuality of Black existence. We tend not to want to think about it as something that appropriates, what can be understood as a Eurocentric genre.
Right.
But that's not to say that that existence is any less horrifying than that genre itself.
Now, is there an equivalent in other culture? I mean, in white culture, whatever, like that kind of approach, or is this somewhat unique because of the unique circumstances of African Americans in the U.S.?
Well, there are some similarities to, for instance, Southern Gothic fiction, right? Which looks at the horror of this haunting of Southern tradition, this tradition which on the one hand offers one a degree of gentility, of respect, has this sort of this sense of tradition to it that one doesn't want to let go of. But at the same time, that tradition comes with all of these aristocratic ideologies. It comes with these racial oppressions. It comes with this sense of agrarianism that doesn't necessarily fit in the industrial age, right? And while that may be mourned, at the same time, there's a desire to move forward as well, right? And so that sort of conflict between the past, which on the one hand holds some, useful heritage, but part of that heritage is horrifying, something that you don't want to remember.
The baggage that comes with it almost overwhelms the other part. When we come back, let's talk a little bit more about that, and I think, because I know we've had people on to talk about the abolitionist movement, and of course there were white Southerners who went, this is horrible, and were opposed to that. So, but that same, they lived a rather interesting life, a very, luxurious, autocratic life, but yet recognize some of exactly what you were describing, that this comes with some very bad things. Is this really right, or isn't it? So we can talk about that and how that was maybe addressed as we move through the years in just a moment. We'll be back on Northwest Ohio Journal right after this. And we're back on Northwest Ohio Journal. My guest is Dr. Maisha Wester here at Bowling Green State University. And we're talking about the Gothic view of African American history. And obviously we've talked about the timeline of this, and your book talks about starting with slave narratives and that sort of thing. But there's an interesting approach as to how both sides of, in essence, the slavery movement used this Gothic approach in literature to take their own position.
Yeah, well, what you see is in terms of the abolitionists, you'll see them portray slaves in a sympathetic light by vilifying the slave owners in these very stereotypical Gothic manners, right? Many of which are adopted by slave narratives themselves. But on the other side, you have pro-slavery supporters arguing against the horrors of the freed black, right, in which this body is presented as a sort of Frankenstein creature. And what's really interesting is the ways in which the Haitian Revolution gets Gothicized in American political discourse, right? Because the Americas are really coming into the sort of literary being and maturity in terms of the Gothic genre just after the Haitian Revolution. And so at the same time, you have this anxiety about what the Haitian Revolution is going to say to the slaves in America, right? And so what one sees quite often, both in legislative debates and newspaper accounts, is this presentation of the revolution that assumes extremely Gothic terms. It reads as if it's something from your average nightmare, right? Thomas Dew literally uses the phrase and the metaphor of Frankenstein to describe the freed slaves of Haiti and the possibility of freed slaves in America in his presentation to the Virginia legislature. I believe that was 1831. I could be wrong on that date. And so what you see is both sides picking up on a literary genre and its tropes to describe and to try to grapple with the reality of life in Americas. And for Toni Morrison, this is actually understandable because for her, America is inherently given to using Gothic tropes because of when it was born as a nation, and also because of the conflicts between its ideals as a country versus what it does to, a fair amount of its people, right? And so this notion that it provides liberty to a majority by denying liberty and freedom and humanity to another, right, that this produced such a conflictual, paranoid and panicked position in the American psyche that the Gothics just sort of became
just almost was a perfect fit in a bad kind of way.
Exactly, because America is very much haunted by its ideals and by its actual practices.
Yeah, and I guess the writing, as you said, from the pro-slavery side, obviously the goal, and both sides using, I would say, extreme examples, but kind of things, says, the Haitian Revolution, that's going to create, we don't want that because if we have it here, look at how bad it's going to be. Look at what will, it's interesting that was the approach, which was to play into that paranoia about what would happen. Don't trust me, it'll be horrible. And I guess then on the other side, the people that are writing who are saying, here's the other side of that story. Were they going to that extreme, or were they? I mean, obviously they had to present this fictionalized version of what was going on, but did they go? I mean, they were going the paranoia route, the scare route, because there was a positive approach in a way, or am I just totally off base on that?
They were doing both. So not all abolitionists were for freeing slaves and having them be citizens. There was this sense of the way slavery was corrupting the United States, right? And so that slavery was just a bad system, not that black should necessarily be equal to everyone, but that we should do away with slavery and then figure out what to do with this black population. There was also a sense of how slavery really did produce these debased and warped slave masters, that even someone who started out kind-hearted would become warped and cruel. Frederick Douglass is an excellent example
Sure.
of this in his slave narratives. He talks about a slave mistress who starts out as kind, but the longer she stays in the southern states, the worse she gets until she's an absolute monster. And this isn't at all atypical. You know, there is this, so there is an element of paranoia as well as a desire to render the slave sympathetic. Another excellent example is Herman Melville, right?
Sure.
If you read Benito Cereno, it's a perfect Gothic manuscript, but it's also one which is paranoid about what will happen if we allow slavery to continue in the American states, how that's going to produce this sort of masquerade which hides various horrors and corruptions and decay, and that both the slave and the slave master become monsters in this system.
Yeah, because the system drives both of them. It is impactful in a very negative way to the slave, obviously, but then also kind of desensitizes, as you're saying, sort of hardens someone who starts out benevolent might be too good a word, but starts out with at least sort of trying to be a little more open to treating people as well as they can in that sort of scenario. But the system makes them become worse than that, and you're right. So and the one argument, as you're saying, is kind of interesting, is that that's bad for America. You know, and you're right. Not necessarily the slave thing is a whole other issue, but so it's almost in a way kind of again blaming the slaves for the problem. So we'll solve our problem so we don't feel as bad about who we are, and it's a corruptive influence, but we don't really have a solution for the rest of it. It's an interesting approach to it that a lot of people would probably not think about in that regard. Now, you've mentioned a couple people who've written books in that time frame. Would there be other people that we should become familiar with who wrote in the time of Frederick Douglass and that sort of thing as well, or are those the point people?
Oh, no. Well, if we're thinking of African-American authors writing in the time of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs is a really important one. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, profoundly Gothic text, as if she's writing by the book Gothic tropes. Henry Box Brown, very interesting one. And interesting both in terms of how he escapes, but also in terms of the turns his narratives take.
Now, where would and I know it's not Gothic. At least I believe it is. You know, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Any marginal even connection, or is that's a totally different look at it?
No, there are Gothic elements of Uncle Tom's Cabin, especially in the presentation of the slave driver. But I think Stow's novel really plays on the sympathy card more so than
the horror.
Than the horror,
I mean, it uses the horror to evoke sympathy, not to make you feel the horror, but in a sympathetic way versus I'm appalled by that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Someone who I think is more complicated in the presentation of slavery and the abolitionist argument is Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, which many people have read as a representation of both sides of the slavery argument. So on the one hand, this question of a slave master that creates this monster, this beast, who is initially childlike, and the ways in which the slave masters, or the masters, I shouldn't call them slave masters, the way in which the masters' behaviors produce the monstrosity.
Turn a pleasant sort of childlike figure into drive
monster.
it to be a monster.
Exactly, and yet at the same time, the depths of Frankenstein monster's rage alludes to some innate sense of depravity and anger, which is beyond human, right? And so in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you get both sides of the argument. On the one hand, the sense of we've created and dealt with this population in ways that are unjust, that are careless, and as a consequence, we've created our own monsters. But on the other hand, there's an anxiety about the difference, the innate difference between African Americans and well, not African Americans, between Africans and whites, right? Because Mary Shelley is writing in Britain.
Right. Good.
And so an anxiety about the ways in which the black population may be depraved or may be innately vengeful and rageful to a level of destruction that whites can't possibly comprehend.
Okay. We'll be back in just a moment here on Northwest Ohio Journal. We're here on Northwest Ohio Journal. My guest is Dr. Myesha Wester. We've talked a little bit about the 1800s and the genre, the Gothic approach to African American history. As we move closer to contemporary writers, what do we see after that 1800s? What are the people that are in there before we get to the contemporary people?
Well, two that most don't think about are Jean Toomer. His amazing text, Cain, is a profoundly Gothic text as well as Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Now, these are two that are such rich texts that honestly one can do an entire study of each as a Gothic text on its own. I try to condense it into one chapter. But each presents Southern Gothic landscapes, right? So for instance, Jean Toomer's Cain, the first section, which is the southern section, ends in blood with lynching and a bloody moon hanging above the sky. And this flowing blood carries on into the next section, which is the northern section. Most people somehow overlook the violence, the brutality, and the horror of, these aspects of Jean Toomer's Cain. Though I don't know how. There's the blood-burning moon, which is
they get caught up in some other part of the story, and somehow that just blends into the background somehow, I guess.
Well, admittedly, Cain is a difficult text. It's rich. It's a puzzle of a text, but it's a marvelous puzzle. But blood-burning moon which is the capstone to the first section, begins by describing a place, an old factory, as if it were a skeleton, right? It's profoundly Gothic. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is almost a study in the grotesque in his southern section. I love his southern section. It's brilliant for the narratives of haunting, the incest. There's literally an insane asylum down the road from the college in the southern section. But even once he moves to the north, there's these moments of lynching, of uncanniness that pop up in his presentations of characters. One text that I didn't get to talk about in this book because it was such a huge study as it is, was Richard Wright's Native Son, which most people don't think about as a Gothic text.
Sure,
but James Smethurst has done a wonderful study of Native Son in his article on the text, in which he argues the ways in which Wright rewrites the Frankenstein movie for his climactic scene in Native Son. Native Son speaks directly back to Poe, right? He rewrites Poe's Black Cat in one of the early sections of the text. So this is a genre that's getting used by major authors in African American literary canon, from Harlem Renaissance on up into modern day with writers such as Alice Walker, right? Her novel Meridian literally has a horror story at the very center of the text. Like it's perfectly, the text perfectly divides around her horror story. And it's the story of a slave whose tongue is cut out because she tells horror stories to the master's children, and one of the children has a heart attack.
So it's,
So it's the real horror of a slave that's punished for telling horror stories. Right.
Oh, wow. That's which brings it sort of completely back around again. Now, we've got just a minute or two. What would be some of the contemporary writers that people would say, okay, if you wanted to start with a contemporary writer in this genre, who should they look for?
Well, I've already mentioned Randall Keenan.
Sure,
is an amazing writer, beautiful writer. There's such poetry to his text, but he also relays such horrifying incidents in his stories. Alice Walker is another one that people don't typically think about. Gloria Naylor's Linden Hills is a profoundly Gothic text. And then Toni Morrison, who admittedly denies being Gothic, but so many of her texts straddles the line between magical realism and the Gothic. And the Gothic appears in her texts at very specific moments. Right? She mobilizes it to convey a very specific sort of horror depending on which text you're in.
Now, we've got about 30 seconds. Obviously, we could start with your book. What would be the one takeaway that people should think about when we're talking about this Gothic view of African American history?
That it's not just me or African Americans applying a European model to African American literature, rather it's a complex appropriation of the Gothic, so complex that it's almost a revision, a complete rewriting of the Gothic genre itself. And at the same time, this rewriting has some things in common with the Southern Gothic, but African American Gothic came first.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Myesha Wester from Bowling Green State University. Thank you for joining us here on Northwest Ohio Journal. Check us out at WBGU.org and join us again next week on Northwest Ohio Journal.